From clay tablets pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago, to king lists that defy every chronology we've built since, the Sumerians left us records we still don't know how to read. We've always assumed ancient myths were humanity's first attempts to make sense of lightning, floods, and death, poetic fictions wrapped around natural phenomena. But the Sumerian archives tell a different story. They document beings called the Anunnaki, with the same precision they used to track grain shipments and land disputes, names, ranks, cities, arguments, failures. These weren't metaphors pressed into clay. They were records that treated gods the way census takers treat citizens. In this deep dive, we'll examine 10 claims, preserved in cuneiform, that archaeology cannot confirm and cannot dismiss. We'll trace rulers who reigned for tens of thousands of years, measured in units no one explains. We'll follow kingship that fell from the sky rather than rising from the earth. We'll witness gods who didn't act divine at all. They starved, panicked, and fled disasters they couldn't control. We'll uncover testimony that knowledge was inherited, not invented, and explore why the world's first civilization recorded a past that refuses to fit our definitions of history or mythology. Before we descend deeper, ignite that like button and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. And, as always, with our videos, the visuals are here to add context, but they aren't necessary to follow along. So whether you're watching closely or just listening in, settle in and let the outside world fade for a while. Thank you for always having our back. Prepare yourself, and let's dive in. To understand why these Sumerian claims unsettle modern archaeology, you have to forget the epic poems first. Forget Gilgamesh. Forget creation myths. Start instead with something far more disturbing: bookkeeping. Around 3200 BC, in the mud-brick cities of southern Mesopotamia, scribes began pressing reed styluses into soft clay, creating the world's first writing system. They weren't composing poetry. They were counting barley rations for temple workers, livestock inventories, labor assignments. The birth of writing was the birth of bureaucracy, cold, precise, obsessively detailed. These were administrators, not storytellers. Their professional survival depended on accuracy. A scribe who miscounted grain-faced punishment. A scribe who falsified temple records faced worse. And yet, buried in the same archives that meticulously tracked every shekel of silver and every jar of oil, we find something that doesn't belong: systematic records of beings called the Anunnaki, not described as symbols or lessons or forces of nature, but catalogued with names, genealogies, city assignments, and administrative hierarchies, treated exactly like the human officials whose grain rations filled the tablets around them. The problem isn't translation. Cuneiform was cracked in the 19th century. Thousands of tablets have been read, cross-referenced, and published. We know what the Sumerians wrote. The problem is that what they wrote doesn't conform to any category we've built to contain it. It's too organized to be mythology, too strange to be history, too consistent across centuries and cities to be dismissed as creative fiction. Consider what sits in the British Museum under catalogue number WB444, the Sumerian King List, composed around 2100 BC. It represents one of the most studied and most troubling documents from the ancient world. The tablet is formatted like a royal chronicle. city names, dynasty names, ruler names, reign lengths, cold, sequential, administrative. The kind of document you'd expect to find in any palace archive, recording the succession of power through time. But then you read the numbers. The opening line states, without ceremony, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Already there's something off. Not after the first king rose to power, or when leadership began among men. The kingship descended from heaven, as though governance itself arrived from somewhere else, lowered into place like cargo being unloaded. But it's what follows that creates the real problem. The first king listed is Alulim, his reign, 28,800 years. Not a typo, not a mistranslation, 28,800 years. The second king, Alalgar, 36,000 years. The third, En-Menluana, 43,200 years. The pattern continues through 8 rulers, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. Then the list adds almost casually, then the flood swept over. After the flood, the numbers drop, but they remain impossible. Etana of Kish, 1,560 years. Enmenbaraj-Si, 900 years. Enmenbaraj-Si's son Aga of Kish, 625 years. Only in the later dynasties, around the time the list was actually composed, do the reign lengths begin approaching what a human lifetime could contain. 30 years, 22 years, 15 years, numbers that make sense. The structure itself is what disturbs. If these pre-flood figures were symbolic exaggerations, mythological flourishes added to glorify ancient kingship, you'd expect poetic language, divine epithets, legendary deeds attached to each name. You'd expect the emotional weight of an epic. But the Sumerian king list reads like a tax ledger. City, ruler, years, next. City, ruler, years, next. The tone never shifts. The format never breaks. The impossible and the plausible are documented with identical bureaucratic indifference. We have multiple copies of this king list. They've been found in different cities, Nippur, Larsa, Isin, composed at different times across several centuries, and every copy preserves the same impossible numbers. 28,800 years for Alulim, 36,000 for Alalgar. The consistency is what archaeologists can't explain away. If these were oral traditions that got inflated over time, different cities should show different inflations. But they don't. The numbers remain locked. Scholars have proposed explanations. The most common, these figures are symbolic, representing eras rather than individual reigns, or they've been inflated through sexagesimal mathematical errors when converted from older numerical systems we don't understand. Some suggest the numbers represent months, not years, though that still leaves the first kings reigning for 2,400 years each. Others propose that year meant something different in pre-flood context. Perhaps a season, a lunar cycle, some other unit of time measurement. But here's what none of these explanations address. Why don't the Sumerians themselves ever explain the numbers? If you were recording kings who ruled for symbolic ages, or if you were converting from an old calendar system into a new one, or if year meant something different before the flood than after, wouldn't you say so? Wouldn't there be commentary, footnotes, some scribe somewhere adding a clarification? Ancient Mesopotamian scribes loved explanatory glosses. They added them to difficult words, to archaic grammar, to unusual spellings. They cross-referenced, they annotated, they explained. But for the king list numbers, silence. The figures simply sit there, carved into clay, daring you to make sense of them. And the Sumerian scribes who copied and recopied this document over centuries apparently saw no need to justify, explain, or apologize for them. They recorded 28,800-year reigns with the same administrative neutrality they used to record 28-year reigns. There's another detail that deepens the problem. The king list doesn't transition abruptly from impossible to possible. It graduates. The pre-flood kings reigned for tens of thousands of years. The immediate post-flood kings reigned for thousands, then hundreds, then decades. It's a smooth mathematical descent, as though the document is tracking an actual decay curve, some factor that was affecting lifespan or time measurement or something else, gradually normalizing over generations until it reached what we'd recognize as human-scale numbers. If this were pure mythology, why include that gradual transition? Why not just say, before the flood, kings were immortal and reigned forever. After the flood, they became mortal and reigned for normal spans. The measured descent from 28,800 to 1,560 to 625 to 30 suggests the scribes believed they were tracking something real, something that changed according to some principle, even if that principle makes no sense to us. And then there's what the king list reveals about Sumerian historical consciousness. These weren't naive people. By 2100 BC, when this list was composed, the Sumerians had over 1,000 years of continuous urban civilization behind them. They had libraries, schools, international trade networks, legal codes, astronomical observations, mathematical innovations. They knew how long people actually lived. They had genealogies of their own recent kings that showed normal human lifespans. They understood time. So when they included 28,800-year reigns in their official royal chronicle, they weren't making a mistake. They were making a choice. The Sumerian king list stands as an artifact that cannot be comfortably categorized. It's not mythology. It lacks mythological language and structure. It's not history. It contains numbers that defy historical possibility. It's not propaganda. It doesn't glorify the ancient kings with deeds or epithets, just cold numerics. It's not a mistake. It's too consistent across too many copies. It's a record, compiled with the same bureaucratic precision the Sumerians applied to everything they documented. And what it records, quite simply, is a chronology from another world, a timeline that doesn't fit into ours, numbers that refuse to resolve. Archaeology cannot confirm these reign lengths. No physical evidence supports 28,800-year-old kings, no bones, no artifacts, no ruins that date back 241,200 years to the start of that pre-flood dynasty. But archaeology cannot dismiss them either, because the Sumerians themselves, the inventors of writing, the founders of cities, the creators of the administrative systems that would spread throughout the ancient Near East, they wrote these numbers down, copied them faithfully, preserved them across centuries, and never once suggested they were anything other than what they appeared to be, the official record of kingship's duration on earth before the flood swept over. The question the king list poses isn't whether we believe these numbers. The question is, why did the Sumerians? What were they looking at that made 28,800-year reigns seem like the appropriate figures to record? What source were they working from? What understanding of time or measurement or history did they possess that we've lost? The king list offers no answers. It just sits there in museum archives around the world, tablets pressed 4,000 years ago by scribes who apparently saw nothing unusual about documenting the impossible right alongside the mundane. Grain rations and god kings, barley inventories and 36,000-year dynasties, all recorded in the same hand, with the same neutral precision. Too organized to be myth, too strange to be history, cannot confirm, cannot dismiss. But the numbers themselves aren't the strangest part of the Sumerian king list. The strangest part is the opening phrase, the one that appears before any kings are named, after the kingship descended from heaven. Not when the gods granted kingship, not when leadership arose among men. Descended from heaven, as though kingship, the entire concept of organized governance, came from somewhere else. And that phrase leads directly to the second claim, one that transforms the king list from a chronological puzzle into something far more unsettling. The phrase appears in every version of the Sumerian king list, Nam Lugal Anta Ed Deha. Word by word, kingship from heaven lowered was. In translation, it's usually rendered poetically, after the kingship descended from heaven, or when kingship was lowered from heaven. The English makes it sound mythological, like divine blessing or celestial appointment. But the Sumerian verb choice tells a different story. The word AD means to go down, to descend, to lower. It's the same verb used throughout Sumerian administrative texts to describe moving physical objects from one location to another, lowering grain baskets from storage platforms, descending ladders, moving cargo from upper floors to ground level. It's a technical term for spatial transfer, not a metaphorical term for divine blessing. When Sumerian scribes wanted to express divine favor or selection, they had other vocabulary. A king could be chosen by a god. Different verb. A king could be called to rule. Different construction. A king could receive the mandate of heaven. Different phrase entirely. Sumerian was a sophisticated language with precise theological terminology for every shade of divine human interaction. But for the origin of kingship itself, they used the verb for lowering cargo. This matters because Sumerian scribes were exact. They didn't accidentally use warehouse terminology when they meant divine blessing. They used AD, because that's what they believed happened. Kingship was transferred downward, moved from one location to another, like an administrative function being relocated. The Eridu Genesis, another early Sumerian text catalogued as CBS Wendo 603 in the University of Pennsylvania Museum collection, expands on this. It describes 5 cities established before the flood swept over: Eridu, Bad Tabaira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Each city received specific functions. Eridu, wisdom and freshwater management. Bad Tabira, metalworking. Larak, ritual purification. Sippar, justice and law. Shuruppak, weaving and textile production. The text doesn't describe these cities developing their specializations over time through cultural evolution or economic advantage. It describes the specializations being assigned, allocated, distributed according to a plan established before the cities operated. This is organizational design language. You see it in corporate restructuring documents, in government departmental assignments, in any large-scale administrative system where functions are divided and delegated. But you don't typically see it in creation mythology. Egyptian myths don't describe the gods sitting down to assign cities their economic specializations. Greek myths don't allocate metallurgy to one city-state and textile production to another, according to pre-flood administrative planning. Only the Sumerian texts treat civilization's beginning as though someone drew up an organizational chart. And kingship, the executive function that would coordinate all these specialized cities, that was lowered from heaven to make the system operational. The timeline presents another problem. The Sumerian king list specifies that kingship descended from heaven first, and then the first city, Eridu, received it. Not that Eridu developed kingship. Not that the people of Eridu created governance structures that other cities then copied. Kingship existed before any human city received it. It was a transferable asset, moved into place. Other Mesopotamian cultures described kingship differently. The Babylonians, who inherited much from the Sumerians, said that Marduk granted kingship to human rulers. The Assyrians said their kings were chosen by Ashur. These are blessing narratives, gods selecting humans and bestowing authority on them. But the Sumerians consistently used transfer terminology, not granted, not chosen, lowered, descended, moved from point A to point B, and they applied this language exclusively to the pre-flood period. When the king list reaches historical dynasties, kings the Sumerians knew were human, whose graves they could visit, whose descendants still lived. The language changes. Those kings seized kingship through conquest, or received it through succession, or held it during their reigns. Normal political language, human agency language. The transfer from heaven language appears only for the original establishment of governance, before the flood, in the time of the impossible reign-length kings. It's as though the Sumerians were distinguishing between two categories: the kingship system itself, which came from elsewhere, and the human individuals who later operated within that system. The system was imported. The operators were local. Modern scholarship treats kingship descended from heaven as a legitimization myth. The theory goes, early Sumerian rulers wanted to justify their authority, so they claimed their governance system had divine origin. Every king could then say, "I'm not just powerful, I'm operating within a structure the gods themselves established." The problem with this explanation is that it doesn't account for why the Sumerians would describe divine legitimization using administrative transfer language instead of blessing language. If you're inventing a myth to make your kingship seem divinely ordained, you want it to sound majestic. You want the gods choosing you, anointing you, crowning you with their favor. You don't want it to sound like furniture delivery. The gods' lowered kingship from the warehouse in the sky doesn't have quite the same mythological gravitas as the gods in their wisdom chose our city to receive the sacred crown. But that's essentially what the Sumerian text says, and they never bothered to dress it up. There's also the matter of consistency. The descended from heaven phrase appears in king lists from Nippur, Larsa, Isin, and Ur, cities that were sometimes political rivals, sometimes even at war with each other. Each city wanted to claim legitimacy for its own dynasty. Each had every reason to adjust the origin story of kingship to favor its own rulers. But they all preserved the same phrase. Kingship descended from heaven, to Eridu first, then distributed to other cities according to a sequence the texts carefully maintain. None of the cities tried to rewrite the narrative to make their own city the first recipient. They all acknowledged Eridu's primacy, even when Eridu was a minor settlement, and they were the powerful centers. That kind of consistency across political boundaries suggests the phrase wasn't invented for propaganda purposes. It suggests the scribes were copying something they considered fixed record, not flexible mythology they could adapt to current political needs. And then, there's what the phrase implies about the pre-transfer situation. If kingship descended from heaven, if it was lowered to earth, then before the transfer, kingship was somewhere else, operating in some other context, governing some other population. The Sumerian texts don't explore this implication. They don't describe what heaven's political structure looked like, or why kingship was transferred away from it. They just note the transfer as fact and move on to listing the kings who operated under the transferred system. But the implication sits there. Governance existed before humans had it. Administrative structure preceded human civilization. The organizational chart was drawn up somewhere else and then implemented here. This brings us back to the question of what the Sumerians thought they were recording. If these texts are mythology, stories invented to explain the origin of political authority, they're mythology of a very strange kind. They lack divine drama. They lack the personalities and conflicts and transformations that make myths compelling. They read like extremely boring meeting minutes from a reorganization committee. But if they're not mythology, if the Sumerians thought they were recording actual events, then they believed that human governance didn't develop organically from tribal structures or emerge gradually through social complexity. They believed it arrived as a complete system, transferred from an external source, implemented according to a plan. Either way, the documents resist easy categorization, too administrative to be myth, too impossible to be history, and too consistent across too many cities over too many centuries to be dismissed as scribal error or creative fiction. The phrase, kingship descended from heaven, appears in the same tablets that record grain shipments and temple inventories, filed in the same archives, copied by the same scribes, treated with the same bureaucratic neutrality. And no Sumerian text ever explains what it means. They just state it. Kingship was lowered from heaven to Eridu. Then the first king ruled for 28,800 years. Then the second king ruled for 36,000 years. Then the flood swept over. Then kingship moved to Kish. All documented in the same flat administrative tone. The question isn't whether we believe kingship literally descended from the sky. The question is what the Sumerians saw, or what records they had access to, that made that phrasing seem like the accurate way to describe how governance began. But if kingship was transferred from heaven, and if the impossible reign kings operated that transferred system, then the real administrative question becomes, who held authority before the transfer? Who was kingship being transferred from? The Sumerian answer to that question is where the documents move from puzzling to genuinely disturbing. The Anunnaki appear throughout Sumerian literature, but not the way gods appear in other ancient pantheons. They don't emerge from primordial chaos or get born from cosmic eggs or spring from the foreheads of other deities. They're already there when the texts begin, already organized, already assigned to specific functions, and those assignments read like a corporate structure chart. Enki, freshwater, the Abzu, craftsmanship, wisdom. Base of operations, Eridu. Enlil, atmosphere, storms, executive authority. Base of operations, Nippur. Inanna, Venus, warfare, love. Base of operations, Uruk. Ninhursag, fertility, birth, mountains. No fixed city, mobile jurisdiction. Utu, sun, justice, truth. Base of operations, Larsa. Nana, moon, time measurement, calendar. Base of operations, Ur. These aren't poetic associations. They're documented jurisdictions maintained across hundreds of tablets spanning over 1,000 years. Temple hymns catalog them. Cylinder seals depict them. Administrative texts reference them when describing resource allocation to different divine departments. And the jurisdictions don't overlap. This is the detail that separates Sumerian divine organization from every other ancient pantheon. Greek gods constantly interfered in each other's domains, Athena in Poseidon's territory, Aphrodite in Artemis's realm, Zeus overriding everyone. Egyptian gods merged and split and shared attributes fluidly, Ra-Harakti, Amun-Ra, Ptah-Sokar, Osiris. Divine boundaries were permeable, negotiable, constantly shifting. But Sumerian texts maintain rigid jurisdictional boundaries. Enki doesn't manage the atmosphere. That's Enlil's portfolio. Enlil doesn't control fresh water. That's Enki's domain. Nana tracks time through lunar cycles, but doesn't touch solar time. That's Utu's responsibility. When boundaries do get crossed, the texts record it as a violation. The most famous example, Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization. Inanna travels to Eridu, gets Enki drunk, and steals the me, the fundamental packages of civilizational knowledge that Enki controlled. The text doesn't describe this as a charming mythological adventure. It describes it as jurisdictional theft. Enki, once he sobers up, realizes what happened and sends forces to retrieve the stolen me. A chase ensues. Inanna escapes to Uruk with the me. Enki's attempts at recovery fail. And the text concludes by documenting which specific me were permanently transferred from Enki's jurisdiction to Inanna's. This is bureaucratic dispute language. Department A had assets. Department B acquired those assets through questionable means. Department A attempted to recover them. Department B successfully defended its acquisition. The assets now officially belong to Department B. Case closed. Update the records. Not exactly the kind of language you'd expect in mythology about gods and cosmic powers. Other texts show similar jurisdictional awareness. When the Anunnaki hold assemblies to make decisions, specific gods speak to specific issues based on their portfolios. Enlil addresses matters of political authority and atmospheric disasters. Enki speaks on matters of wisdom, craftsmanship, and water management. Ninhursag contributes on issues of birth and population. Each stays within their documented area of responsibility. The organizational structure appears to have ranks as well. Enlil is repeatedly called the decision-maker, suggesting executive authority. Enki is the wise one, implying advisory role. Some Anunnaki are described as great Anunnaki, while others are simply Anunnaki, a hierarchy distinction. The Igigi, another class of beings in the texts, appear to hold lower rank, assigned to physical labor before human creation. These distinctions matter because they reveal how the Sumerians conceptualized divine organization. Not as a family of supernatural beings with vague mythological roles, but as a structured hierarchy with clear lines of authority, defined responsibilities, and established protocols for decision-making. The mainstream explanation treats this as projection. The theory: Sumerian cities were organized as independent city-states, each with its own patron deity and specialized economic function. Uruk focused on textiles, Ur on trade, Eridu on fishing. The Sumerians, according to this explanation, simply projected their political reality onto the divine realm. They organized the gods to match how they organized themselves. It's a reasonable theory. It would explain the jurisdictional precision, the administrative language, the careful documentation of divine responsibilities. But it doesn't explain why the jurisdictions are organized around natural phenomena and fundamental knowledge rather than economic specializations. If the Sumerians were projecting their city-state system onto the gods, you'd expect deities of trade, warfare, agriculture, metallurgy, construction, the actual activities cities specialized in. Instead, the Anunnaki portfolios cover atmosphere, fresh water, celestial bodies, fertility, wisdom, fundamental systems that underlie all human activity. It's the difference between managing industries and managing infrastructure. The Sumerian gods weren't divine versions of guild masters. They were assigned to the foundational systems that made civilization possible: water, weather, time, knowledge, reproduction. There's also the problem of consistency across cities that had every reason to emphasize their own gods. Uruk should have inflated Inanna's importance. Ur should have elevated Nanna. Nippur should have made Enlil supreme beyond question. And, to some extent, each city did emphasize its patron deity in its own literature. But when it came to documenting jurisdictions, all the cities agreed. The temple hymns from Uruk acknowledge Enki's control of fresh water, even though Enki's city was Eridu. The texts from Ur recognize Enlil's authority over storms, even though Enlil's city was Nippur. Nobody tried to reassign portfolios to favor their local god. That kind of consistency suggests the jurisdictional assignments weren't invented by individual cities to promote their own deities. The cities were all working from the same source, the same organizational chart, the same fundamental understanding of how divine administration was structured. And they maintained that structure for over 1,000 years. From the earliest pictographic texts around 3200 BC through the fully developed cuneiform literature of 2100 BC, the Anunnaki portfolios remain stable. Enki always controls fresh water. Enlil always manages atmosphere. Inanna always holds Venus, war, and love. A strange combination that makes sense only if you understand these as inherited assignments, not logical categorizations. The texts never explain why these particular functions got grouped together. Why does the goddess of warfare also control love and the planet Venus? Why does the god of fresh water also manage wisdom and craftsmanship? There's no obvious thematic connection. But the assignments are never questioned, never revised, never redistributed. It's as though the Sumerians inherited an organizational structure they didn't fully understand, but felt obligated to preserve accurately. The jurisdictional precision even extends to geographical boundaries. Enki's domain, the Abzu, is specifically described as the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. Not rivers, those flow on the surface. Not rain, that comes from the atmosphere. Enlil's jurisdiction. The Abzu is the underground source, the aquifer, the deep water table that wells and springs tap into. This level of specificity suggests actual territorial boundaries, not poetic descriptions of natural forces. The texts distinguish between types of water, the way property records distinguish between parcels of land. This water belongs to this jurisdiction. That water belongs to that jurisdiction. Boundaries are clear, documented, enforced. And then there are the disputes. Gods argue in Sumerian texts, but they argue about policy, not about territory. The famous assembly scene in the Atrahasis epic shows the Anunnaki debating whether to destroy humanity with a flood. It's presented as a policy dispute within an organization, not a territorial conflict between rival powers. Enlil argues for population reduction. Enki argues against it. Other Anunnaki take positions. A vote is held. The decision goes against Enki, but he doesn't rebel or start a war. He works within the system, finding a loophole, saving one human family, rather than challenging the assembly's authority to make the decision. This is institutional behavior. Following organizational protocols even when you disagree with the outcome. Accepting that the assembly has legitimate decision-making power, even when it rules against your position. Not exactly the behavior you'd expect from all-powerful deities who could simply impose their will through force. The Anunnaki, as documented in Sumerian texts, had power within their jurisdictions, but operated within an organizational structure that limited their autonomy. They made decisions collectively. They followed established procedures. They respected boundaries. They acted, in other words, like administrators managing a complex system, according to established protocols. Which brings us back to the fundamental question these texts pose. Were the Sumerians inventing a bureaucratic mythology unlike anything else in the ancient world, maintaining it with perfect consistency across competing city-states for over 1,000 years? Or were they documenting an actual organizational structure they had encountered, inherited, or been told about, recording it with the same administrative precision they applied to everything else they wrote down? The texts themselves don't speculate. They just document. Enki controls the Abzu and wisdom and craftsmanship, based in Eridu. Enlil controls atmosphere and executive authority, based in Nippur. Jurisdictions clear, boundaries maintained. No overlaps, no explanations. Filed in the archives right next to the grain inventories. But if the Anunnaki had jurisdictions, if they operated within an organizational hierarchy, if they made decisions collectively rather than individually, then the documents that describe their meetings become something more than mythology. They become meeting minutes, records of an assembly that gathered to make policy decisions affecting the human population under their administration. And some of those decisions, according to the Sumerian records, went very badly wrong. The Anunnaki held meetings, not metaphorical gatherings or symbolic councils, but documented assemblies using the same term, ukin, that Sumerian city councils used for their administrative sessions. The word appears throughout Mesopotamian political texts. When the elders of Uruk gathered to decide whether to go to war, they convened an ukin. When Lagash's council met to settle a border dispute with Umma, it was an ukin. When any governing body assembled to debate policy and render decisions, the term was ukin. And when the Anunnaki gathered to make decisions affecting humanity, the texts call it an ukin. Same word. Same grammatical construction, same procedural implications. The assembly scenes in Sumerian literature follow a recognizable format. A problem is presented. Arguments are heard from different parties. Discussion occurs. A decision-maker, usually Enlil, renders a binding judgment. The assembly either accepts the decision or continues debate until consensus emerges. Once decided, the policy is implemented. It's parliamentary procedure. Robert's Rules of Order from 2100 BC. The debate between sheep and grain follows this structure. The text presents sheep and grain, arguing about which is more valuable to humanity. Each makes its case. The assembly listens. Enlil evaluates both arguments and delivers a ruling. The matter is settled. The text ends with the loser accepting the decision. The debate between bird and fish uses identical structure. Two entities present competing claims. Arguments are heard. Judgment is rendered. Case closed. These could be dismissed as literary devices, personified animals debating for educational or entertainment purposes. Except the same assembly structure appears in texts dealing with cosmic-scale decisions. The Atrahasis epic contains the most detailed assembly scene in Sumerian literature. The problem: humanity has multiplied to the point where the noise is disturbing the gods. The complaint is brought before the assembly. Multiple solutions are debated. First proposal: send disease to reduce population. Implemented. Humans survive and multiply again. Second proposal: send drought. Implemented. Humans survive and multiply again. Third proposal: send famine. Implemented. Humans survive and multiply again. Each measure is presented to the assembly, debated, voted on, and executed. Each fails to achieve the desired permanent population reduction. The assembly reconvenes each time to consider the next option. Finally, Enlil proposes the flood. Total reset. Complete destruction of humanity, except for one family, Enki secretly warns. The assembly approves. The flood is initiated. The framing is what disturbs. The decision to destroy humanity isn't presented as divine wrath or moral judgment. It's presented as a noise complaint that escalated through increasingly severe administrative responses. Population management through progressive enforcement measures. The flood, the single most mythologically significant event in ancient Near Eastern literature, is documented as the final solution to an administrative problem the assembly couldn't solve through lesser means. This is not how myths typically work. Myths explain disasters through divine anger, human transgression, cosmic battles between order and chaos. The Mesopotamian flood myths influenced the biblical flood story, which frames the disaster as punishment for wickedness, a moral framework. But the Sumerian version treats it as bureaucratic population control. No moral judgment. No sin and punishment narrative. Just humans too loud. Noise problem persists despite interventions. Assembly votes to eliminate source of noise. Decision implemented. The tone is almost clinical. And then there's what happens during the assembly debates. Gods disagree. They argue. They take opposing positions. In the Atrahasis assembly scenes, Enki consistently opposes Enlil's harsher measures, not through rebellion or divine warfare, but through procedural opposition. He votes against the proposals. He argues for alternative solutions. He works within the system. When the flood decision passes despite his opposition, Enki doesn't challenge the assembly's authority. He doesn't declare war or attempt a coup. He finds a workaround, warning one human family without technically violating the assembly's decision. It's the behavior of a dissenting administrator who disagrees with policy but respects institutional authority. Other texts show similar dynamics. The Lament for Urar describes an assembly decision to allow that city's destruction by invading forces. Multiple gods plead for Ur to be spared. Nana, Ur's patron deity, makes an extended argument before the assembly for why the city should be protected. The assembly hears him out, deliberates, and decides against him. Ur is abandoned to destruction. Nana's response isn't to fight the decision through force. He grieves, but he accepts the assembly's authority to make the call. The lament documents his emotional devastation, but it also documents his institutional compliance. These are not omnipotent beings imposing their individual wills on reality. These are decision-makers operating within an organizational framework that constrains their individual autonomy. They have power, but they exercise it collectively through established procedures. The mainstream explanation treats these assembly scenes as projections of Sumerian political culture onto the divine realm. The Sumerians lived in city-states governed by councils of elders, so they imagined the gods governing the cosmos through similar councils. Divine assemblies are mythological reflections of human political structures. It's a logical explanation. It would account for the procedural similarities, the debate formats, the voting mechanisms. But it doesn't explain why divine assemblies are portrayed as sometimes failing. In the Enuma Elish, a later Babylonian text, but one that inherits Sumerian assembly traditions, the gods gather to address the threat of Tiamat. They debate strategies. Their initial plans fail. They reconvene multiple times because their first decisions don't work. Eventually, Marduk succeeds, but only after the assembly's earlier approaches proved ineffective. If you're projecting human political structures onto gods to legitimize earthly governance, you don't portray the divine assembly as incompetent. You don't show the gods making bad decisions, failing to solve problems, having to reconvene because their policies didn't work. You portray divine governance as perfect, wise, all-knowing, the ideal that human governance should aspire to. But Sumerian and Babylonian texts show divine assemblies struggling with complex problems, implementing solutions that fail, debating without reaching consensus, rendering decisions that turn out to have been mistakes. The Atrahasis flood sequence is essentially a case study in policy failure. The assembly tries disease, drought, and famine before resorting to the flood. Each measure fails. The final solution, total destruction, succeeds in reducing the noise, but also destroys the workforce the gods created humans to provide in the first place. It's a policy outcome with unintended consequences that the later parts of the text show the assembly trying to mitigate. Not exactly inspiring propaganda for divine wisdom. There's another detail that complicates the projection theory. The assembly scenes include procedural elements that have no parallel in Sumerian city governance. Specifically, the gods swear oaths before making certain decisions. Before initiating the flood, the Anunnaki swear an oath binding them to the decision. The text specifies the oath, the binding mechanism, the commitment each god makes. This isn't standard Sumerian political procedure. City councils didn't swear oaths before passing legislation. The oath element appears to be specific to divine assembly protocols. If the Sumerians were simply projecting their own governance onto the gods, why add procedural elements their actual councils didn't use? Why complicate the projection with features that have no earthly parallel? Unless they weren't inventing assembly procedures. Unless they were documenting procedures from a different organizational context, one that included oath-binding mechanisms before major policy implementations. The texts also specify who attends these assemblies. Not all Anunnaki. The great Anunnaki attend. The decision-making Anunnaki participate. There's a distinction between gods who have assembly voting rights and those who don't. Hierarchical structure determines participation rights, and the assemblies convene in specific locations, usually Nippur, at Enlil's temple, sometimes in the Upshukinaku, the Hall of Assembly, a specific architectural structure mentioned repeatedly but never fully described. The location matters. It's documented. The assembly doesn't gather randomly. It convenes in designated space according to established protocol. These specifics accumulate. The procedural consistency, the institutional behavior, the documented locations, the oath mechanisms, the hierarchical participation rights, the policy failures and course corrections. Each individual detail could be explained as creative myth-making, but the pattern, the systematic documentation of administrative procedure applied to divine governance, that pattern is harder to dismiss as mere literary invention, especially when the same texts that document assembly procedures also document assembly failures. The gods make decisions that don't work. They implement policies that backfire. They face problems they can't solve efficiently. The assembly scenes reveal something the jurisdictional assignments already suggested. The Anunnaki, as documented in Sumerian texts, operated within constraints. They had power, but not unlimited power. They had authority, but had to exercise it collectively. They made decisions, but those decisions could fail. They governed more like administrators managing a complex system than like omnipotent deities shaping reality according to their will. And when their administrative decisions went wrong, when the systems they managed spiraled out of their control, the texts record something mythology typically avoids: divine panic. The flood scenes in Sumerian literature contain a detail that undermines every comfortable interpretation of divine omnipotence. When the flood comes, the disaster the assembly voted to implement, the Anunnaki can't control it, and they're terrified. The Atrahasis epic describes the Anunnaki's response to the flood they themselves authorized. The Anunnaki cowered like dogs, crouched against the outer wall. Ishtar screamed like a woman in labor. The mistress of the gods wailed. These aren't poetic descriptions of divine sorrow at humanity's destruction. The language is visceral, animal, physical. The gods cower, they crouch, they press against walls seeking shelter. They're not watching the flood from a position of safety. They're hiding from it. The text continues. The gods were frightened by the deluge. They shrank back, went up to the heaven of Anu. The gods cowered like dogs, crouched outside. They fled, retreated to the heaven of Anu, a location distinct from where they normally operated. The flood forced them to evacuate to a fallback position. This is not omnipotence. This is evacuation protocol. Ishtar's lament in the same text is even more revealing. How could I speak evil in the assembly of the gods? How could I order catastrophe to destroy my people? I myself give birth to my people, like the spawn of fish they fill the sea. She regrets the decision. She identifies humans as my people, a population she's responsible for. And she explicitly states she participated in ordering the catastrophe, using assembly decision-making language. Speak evil in the assembly. The admission is clear. The gods made a decision, implemented it, and then discovered they couldn't stop what they'd set in motion. The Sumerian deluge fragments, older versions of the flood story, contain similar details. The gods wept for them. They couldn't bear to watch the destruction they'd initiated. Multiple gods are described as grief-stricken, not triumphant. But grief isn't the primary emotion the texts document. Fear is. The gods fled because the flood threatened them. The rising waters forced them to retreat to a higher elevation, the heaven of Anu. The text specifies this is where they went to escape the flood's reach, which means their normal operational location was within the flood zone. If the Anunnaki operated somewhere above the flood, in a metaphorical heaven, in a spiritual realm immune to physical disasters, there would be no need to flee. You don't evacuate from a location that can't be damaged. But the texts describe evacuation. Hasty retreat to safe ground while the disaster plays out below. This detail recurs. In multiple flood accounts, the gods are described as either fleeing to higher ground or being unable to prevent the destruction they set in motion. The pattern suggests the Anunnaki operated in physical space that could be affected by physical disasters. The mainstream explanation treats this as literary device. The gods' fear and flight supposedly emphasize the magnitude of the flood. It was so catastrophic even the gods were frightened. Their regret humanizes them, makes them relatable, adds emotional weight to the disaster. But this explanation requires ignoring specific textual details. The gods didn't just feel fear. They took emergency action. They evacuated to a specific location. They crouched outside that location, suggesting they couldn't fully enter or had limited access. And they stayed there until the waters receded. Only after the flood subsided did they descend back to survey the aftermath. This is disaster response behavior. Clear location, assess damage, return when safe. There's another problem with the literary device explanation. If you're trying to emphasize divine power and wisdom, if you're creating mythology to inspire awe and religious devotion, you don't portray your gods as incompetent crisis managers. You don't show them making a decision they immediately regret. You don't describe them cowering and fleeing from consequences they themselves initiated. You don't document their inability to stop a disaster once it's started. The Babylonian version of the flood story, composed later, tries to fix this problem. In Gilgamesh, Tablet 15th, the gods are still frightened by the flood, but the emphasis shifts. They're frightened by its power, but they maintain more dignity. They don't cower or crouch. The later version cleans up the earlier portrayal, makes the gods seem more in control. But the Sumerian versions, the older texts, document panic without mitigation. The Anunnaki authorized the flood, initiated it, and then discovered they'd triggered something beyond their ability to manage. They fled. They hid. They waited it out. And when they descended after the waters receded, they encountered another problem. they'd destroyed their workforce. The Atrahasis epic describes the aftermath. Enlil arrives to inspect the devastation and discovers that one human family survived because Enki warned them. Enlil is furious, not because humans survived, but because his order was disobeyed. But then, the practical problem surfaces. With humanity nearly extinct, who will perform the labor the gods created humans to do in the first place? The same problem that triggered human creation, the Anunnaki needing workforce relief, now reappears. The assembly reconvenes. They debate whether to allow humanity to multiply again. Enki argues for it. Enlil eventually concedes, but demands population control measures be built into the system this time. The decision is framed around workforce management and resource allocation, not morality, not divine human relationships, not spiritual considerations, labor supply and demand, administrative problem-solving. The gods' inability to control the flood reveals something the assembly scenes already suggested. The Anunnaki made decisions, but they operated within a system whose underlying mechanisms they couldn't override. They could vote to send a flood. They couldn't vote to stop it once initiated. They could create humans. They couldn't prevent humans from multiplying beyond target population levels. They had executive authority within defined jurisdictions, but they didn't control the fundamental forces those jurisdictions managed. Enki controlled fresh water, but he couldn't stop the Abzu from flooding if certain conditions were met. Enlil controlled atmosphere, but he couldn't prevent storms from exceeding manageable parameters. They administered systems. They didn't command them at the level of physical law. This distinction appears throughout Sumerian texts. Gods manage domains, but domains operate according to principles the gods work within rather than override. It's the difference between system administrators and system designers. Administrators have authority and power within the system. They make decisions, implement policies, allocate resources. But they can't rewrite the system's fundamental operating code. The Anunnaki, as Sumerian texts document them, functioned as administrators, powerful ones, high-ranking ones, but administrators nonetheless, operating within an organizational structure and physical system whose rules constrained even their considerable authority. When they made bad decisions, when they triggered consequences they couldn't reverse, they faced those consequences. They evacuated. They cowered. They waited. They adapted. They acted, in other words, like decision-makers with significant but limited power, managing systems that could spiral beyond their control if mishandled, not like omnipotent deities who could simply will problems away. The flood narratives are usually read as moral tales about divine judgment and human wickedness. But the Sumerian versions document something different. An administrative failure. A decision made in assembly to solve a noise complaint that escalated into an uncontrollable disaster, forcing the decision-makers to evacuate while the catastrophe they'd authorized played out beyond their ability to stop it. The texts don't moralize about this. They just document it. The assembly decided. The flood came. The gods fled. The gods returned. The problem now required different solution. New policies implemented, filed in the archives with the same neutral administrative tone used to document every other organizational decision and its outcomes. But If the Anunnaki were administrators managing systems with limited power and making decisions that sometimes failed, then the question becomes, what were they actually administering? What was the purpose of their organization? The Sumerian texts provide an answer. And it's not a religious answer. It's a workforce answer. In Sumerian, the word me is pronounced may. It appears throughout their texts, always referring to the same thing: fundamental powers or principles that make civilization function. Kingship is a me. Priesthood is a me. Writing, music, metalworking, law, warfare, all me. But the Sumerian texts don't describe the me as concepts or ideas. They describe them as objects. Physical objects that can be possessed, stolen, transferred, and inventoried. The primary source for understanding the me is a text called Inanna and Enki, the transfer of the arts of civilization. The narrative is straightforward. Inanna travels from her city, Uruk, to Enki's city, Eridu. She visits Enki in his temple. Enki, pleased by her visit, throws a feast. During the feast, he drinks heavily. Inanna encourages this. While Enki is drunk, Inanna asks for the me. Enki, in his impaired state, agrees and hands them over. Inanna immediately loads the me onto her boat and departs for Uruk. When Enki sobers up, he realizes what he's done. He sends his minister Isamud with various supernatural beings to intercept Inanna and recover the me. Multiple interception attempts occur. Each time, Inanna's assistant Ninshubur drives off the pursuers. Inanna successfully reaches Uruk with the me. Enki's recovery attempts fail. The me remain in Uruk. Permanent transfer complete. The story could be read as metaphor, cultural exchange between cities perhaps, or the rise of Uruk as a power center at Eridu's expense. But the text's specific details resist metaphorical interpretation. First, the me are listed, not vaguely referenced, but inventoried. Different versions of the text provide different counts: 7 me in some accounts, over 100 in others, but all versions name them specifically. The items include kingship, godship, the crown, the throne, shepherdship, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of love-making, the kissing of the phallus, prostitution, the art of giving birth, the art of making music, eldership, heroship, power, enmity, straightforwardness, destruction of cities, lamentation, rejoicing of the heart, falsehood art, the cult chamber, the hierodule of heaven, the Gusilim instrument, music, eldership, heroship, power. The list continues. Each me is named, counted, catalogued. This is inventory language. Not poetic description, not symbolic representation. Line item documentation of transferred assets. Second, the transfer mechanism. Inanna doesn't learn these civilizational arts from Enki through instruction. She doesn't gradually absorb cultural knowledge through observation. She takes possession of physical objects that contain or embody these functions, loads them onto a boat, and transports them to Uruk. The text uses the same language for moving the me that it uses for moving cargo. Loaded, transported, delivered, unloaded. Physical transfer requiring physical conveyance. Third, the exclusivity. Once Inanna has the me, Enki no longer possesses them. He can't simply make new copies. He has to attempt physical recovery, and when recovery fails, the me permanently reside in Uruk instead of Eridu. These aren't ideas that spread through cultural diffusion. These are discrete objects that can only be in one place at a time. Fourth, the consequences. After Inanna successfully transfers the me to Uruk, that city's fortunes rise. The text explicitly connects Uruk's growing power and cultural influence to its possession of the me, not because Uruk learned from Eridu, not because knowledge spread naturally, but because Uruk now held the functional packages that Eridu previously controlled. The mainstream explanation treats this as the allegorical account of cultural exchange. Eridu was the older, more established city. Uruk was the rising power. The story of Inanna stealing the me from Enki represents Uruk's cultural ascendancy. Younger city surpassing elder, new center of power replacing old. It's a reasonable reading. Many ancient myths encode political transitions in divine narratives. But the allegory explanation doesn't account for why the transfer is described as theft requiring a getaway boat, rather than as gradual cultural adoption. Real cultural exchange happens through trade, migration, intermarriage, diplomatic contact. Knowledge spreads organically as people move between cities and share techniques, but the text describes Inanna stealing complete packages of civilizational knowledge in a single transaction, fleeing with them before Enki can prevent the transfer, and successfully defending her acquisition against multiple recovery attempts. If this represents gradual cultural diffusion from Eridu to Uruk, the narrative structure is bizarrely ill-fitted to the historical process it supposedly encodes. There's also the problem of the me themselves. The inventory lists don't contain just positive or neutral civilizational functions. They include prostitution, enmity, destruction of cities, falsehood. These aren't achievements cities want to claim credit for adopting. These aren't cultural advances that justify a theft narrative. If you're inventing a myth to explain why your city became powerful, you emphasize the acquisition of positive capabilities: kingship, music, craftsmanship, law. You don't brag about stealing the fundamental power of urban destruction and systematic falsehood. But the me lists include both constructive and destructive capabilities, both creative and corrupting functions, as though civilization requires the complete package, beneficial and harmful elements integrated into a functioning system. This suggests the lists weren't invented for propaganda purposes. They were documenting something the Sumerians believed was actually transferred: the complete operational package of civilization, including its dark elements. Temple texts from both Eridu and Uruk acknowledge this transfer. Eridu texts don't deny it happened. Uruk texts celebrate possessing the me, but don't claim to have invented them. Both cities treat the transfer as historical event, not contested mythology. And there's another detail embedded in the text. When Enki hands over the me, Inanna says she has received them. Not created, not learned, not developed. Received. Passive acquisition of something that already existed in complete form. Later in the text, when Inanna arrives in Uruk with the Ma, she doesn't describe adapting them or modifying them for Uruk's specific needs. She installs them. Implementation language, not innovation language. The me are treated as pre-existing knowledge packages that can be possessed by different cities, but weren't developed by any of them. They existed before any Sumerian city held them. Transfer predates invention. This frames Sumerian civilization in a way unique among ancient cultures. Egyptian texts describe gods teaching humans specific skills: Thoth teaching writing, Ta teaching craftsmanship. Greek myths show culture heroes like Prometheus, bringing fire, or Athena introducing weaving. These are learning narratives. Gods or heroes as teachers, humans as students, knowledge transmitted through instruction. But Sumerian texts describe complete civilizational operating systems existing prior to human possession, transferable as units, installed rather than taught. Either the Sumerians had a radically different conception of cultural development than every other ancient civilization, one that anticipated modern concepts of knowledge transfer and system implementation, or they were documenting their genuine belief that civilizational knowledge arrived as a complete package from an external source, rather than developing organically within their society. The texts don't philosophize about this. They document the transfer with the same administrative precision they apply to documenting grain transfers. Inanna acquired the me from Enki. Enki attempted recovery. Recovery failed. The me now reside in Uruk. Update the records. But if civilization's fundamental operating principles existed as transferable packages before any human city possessed them, the obvious question becomes, transferred from whom? Who held the me before Enki possessed them in Eridu? The texts don't answer this directly, but they do document who created the next element in the system, the workforce that would operate under the transferred civilizational framework. The Atrahasis epic opens with a labor problem. The Anunnaki need infrastructure built, canals dug, rivers maintained, irrigation systems established, food grown, but the work is exhausting. The text specifies that the junior-ranking Anunnaki, called the Agigi, bear the labor burden for 40 years. The number is precise, not a long time or many years. 40 years of continuous hard labor. After 40 years, the Agigi rebel. They burn their tools. They surround Enlil's house at night. The text describes their protest. Every single one of us gods has declared war. The excessive forced labor has killed us. Our work was heavy, the distress too much. This is labor uprising language. Organized protest against working conditions. Collective action by a workforce declaring they've reached breaking point. Enlil wakes to find his residence surrounded. He's frightened. The text specifies this. He sends word to Anu and Enki. An emergency assembly convenes. The problem? The labor force has revolted and refuses to continue working. Enlil's first response is to identify ringleaders and punish them. Standard management response to labor unrest. But Anu intervenes. Why are we blaming them? Their work was too heavy. Their distress was too much. The assembly acknowledges the grievance is legitimate. The work, genuinely, is too hard. The Agigi can't sustain it. But the work still needs to be done. Infrastructure still requires maintenance. Food still needs to be produced. The assembly debates solutions. Enki proposes creating a substitute workforce. The text uses specific language. Let a birth goddess create a human being. Let man assume the drudgery of God. Not let us make humanity in our image, or let us create beings to worship us, or let us fashion companions. The stated purpose is explicit. Create workers to assume the labor burden so the gods can rest. The proposal is accepted. Enki and the birth goddess Nintu collaborate on the creation process. And the text documents that process in unusual detail. First step. Select raw material. Clay from above the Habsu is chosen. Not random clay, specific clay from specific location. Second step. Obtain divine essence. A god named Geshtu-E, described as possessing intelligence, is slaughtered. His blood is mixed into the clay. The text specifies why. From his flesh and blood, let Nintu mix clay, that God and man may be thoroughly mixed in the clay. The purpose is explicit. Human beings are designed to contain divine intelligence, the characteristic that Geshtu-E possessed, within mortal biological form. Intelligence is the critical component being transferred from divine to human. Third step, birth goddess shapes the mixture into forms. 14 forms are created initially, 7 male, 7 female. But here's where the account becomes procedural. The first attempt doesn't produce optimal results. Nintu creates the forms, but the text describes refinement being necessary. Multiple attempts are referenced in fragmentary sections. Trial and error. Adjustments. Another text, Enki and Ninma, provides more detail on the experimental phase. Ninma creates 6 human types with various deficiencies. 1 cannot hold back urine. 1 has neither male nor female genitals. 1 cannot bend his outstretched weak hands. 1 has eyes too weak to see. 1 has trembling hands. 1 has feet too weak to walk. Enki examines each and finds employment for them, roles in temple service that accommodate their limitations. But the clear implication, these are prototypes, test versions, iterations in a design process, seeking optimal configuration. Finally, Ninma produces a successful model. Humans who can perform labor, can reproduce, have sufficient intelligence to learn tasks, but remain mortal and under divine authority. The creation formula is declared successful. Mass production begins. The mainstream explanation treats this as origin mythology explaining human nature. The clay represents our earthly mortality. The divine blood represents our consciousness or soul. The combination explains why humans are caught between animal and divine, mortal bodies containing spark of higher intelligence. It's poetic, it's theologically significant, and it completely misses the procedural specificity of the text. This isn't poetry about human duality. This is documentation of a manufacturing process, raw materials specified, procedure detailed, quality control issues identified, prototypes tested, design refined, successful model replicated. The text even includes production numbers. 14 initial units, then mass production to sufficient numbers to replace Igigi workforce. Specific quantities matter, and the purpose never wavers. Throughout the creation account, the rationale remains constant. Solve the labor shortage. Every step is evaluated against that functional requirement. Does this design produce workers capable of sustaining agricultural and infrastructure labor? If no, adjust design. If yes, proceed to production. No other ancient creation myth frames human origin this way. The biblical account. Humans created in God's image to have relationship with Creator and exercise stewardship over creation. Egyptian accounts. Humans formed from Ra's tears or created by Khnum on potter's wheel. Origin stories emphasizing divine craftsmanship or emotional generation. Greek accounts. Various contradictory origins, but generally involving divine craft or cosmic emergence. Only Sumerian texts document human creation as workforce solution to divine labor crisis. If this were invention, if Sumerian priests were creating mythology to justify their society's class structure, the narrative framing is remarkably counterproductive. It portrays humans as deliberately designed subordinates, created specifically to perform exhausting labor that gods didn't want to do themselves. Not exactly inspiring theology. Not the kind of origin story that encourages religious devotion or cultural pride. But it is the kind of documentation you'd produce if you were recording actual events. A labor crisis occurred, solution was engineered, process was tested, successful design was implemented. The text includes one more detail that complicates comfortable interpretation. When describing the mixture of divine blood and clay, it states that this creates humans with divine spirit, but mortal flesh. The intelligence component comes from Geshtui's blood. The mortality comes from the clay. But intelligence, in this framework, isn't metaphorical. It's genetic material being transferred. Modern language would call it information transfer, taking cognitive template from one source, integrating it into different biological substrate, producing hybrid result. The Sumerian language describes mixing blood and clay, but the functional outcome, intelligent mortal workers, suggests they understood they were combining different types of material to achieve specific characteristics in the result. Either remarkable intuitive grasp of genetic principles, 4,000 years before DNA discovery, or description of actual process using available vocabulary. The text doesn't moralize about human creation. It doesn't celebrate it as gift. It documents it as solution to operational problem. Labor shortage required workforce. Design team created workforce. Quality control ensured optimal performance. Production scaled to meet demand. Filed in the archives next to other problem solution documentation. But the creation account includes one element that wasn't part of the original solution. Humans could reproduce. And that capability, the texts document, created the next crisis the assembly would have to address. The creation process, documented in the Atrahasis epic, contains language that shouldn't exist in texts from 2100 BC. Not because the vocabulary is anachronistic, the Sumerian words are authentic, but because the concepts, those words describe parallel modern genetic engineering principles with unsettling precision. The key passage states, "In the clay, God and man shall be bound, to a unity brought together, so that to the end of days the flesh and the soul, which in a God have ripened, that soul in a blood kinship be bound." The terminology is specific, not metaphorical mixing, but binding. Not symbolic union, but physical integration at material level. Flesh and soul, biological substrate and intelligence, consciousness, combined to produce hybrid result. Break down the procedure as documented. Step 1. Source material selection. Clay is specified as coming from above the Abzu, Enki's freshwater domain, not random clay, sourced from specific location with specific properties. The text distinguishes this clay from ordinary earth. It has to come from above the underground freshwater source. Modern equivalent, selecting appropriate base material with required characteristics for integration process. Step 2. Template acquisition. Geshtu-i, a god described as possessing intelligence, Uzug, is slaughtered. His blood is extracted. The text emphasizes this god specifically had the intelligence characteristic that needed to be transferred. Modern equivalent, extracting genetic information from source that exhibits desired trait. Step 3. Integration, blood mixed thoroughly into clay. The verb is balal, to mix completely, to merge at molecular level, not just superficial combination. The text stresses complete integration. God and man thoroughly mixed. Modern equivalent, Integration of genetic material into target substrate. Step 4. Implementation. Birth goddess Nintu shapes the mixture. But crucially, the text states she shapes forms, while Enki provides the pattern, usurtu, division of labor. Enki supplies design specifications, Nintu implements through biological shaping process. Modern equivalent, blueprint, implementation separation in bioengineering, design specifications distinct from fabrication execution. Step 5. Quality testing. The Enki and Ninma text documents this phase in detail. Ninma creates first-generation humans. 6 exhibit defects: urinary incontinence, genital malformation, paralysis, blindness, trembling, lameness. These aren't random mythological oddities. They're systematic documentation of prototype failures, specific physiological defects that had to be identified and corrected. Enki examines each defective prototype. For each one, he determines whether the defect prevents functionality entirely or whether the unit can serve limited purpose. Some defects are deemed acceptable for specialized roles. Others require design revision. Modern equivalent: quality control testing, defect analysis, acceptable use determination for units outside optimal specifications. Step 6. Design refinement. After prototype testing, refinements are made. The text doesn't detail every adjustment, but it documents that modifications occurred between first-generation defective models and final successful design. Modern equivalent: iterative design process incorporating test results to optimize final product. Step 7. Production scale-up. Once successful design is achieved, the text describes mass production. 14 initial units, 7 male, 7 female, then multiplication through the unit's own reproductive capacity. Modern equivalent: moving from prototype to production scale with built-in replication mechanism. The procedural sequence is what disturbs. This isn't poetic description of divine craftsmanship. This is step-by-step documentation of bioengineering process: source material selection, template extraction, material integration, design specification, prototype fabrication, quality testing, design refinement, production scaling. The mainstream explanation focuses on the symbolic meaning. Clay represents mortality. Divine blood represents consciousness. The combination explains human duality, mortal bodies containing divine spark. The symbolism is valid, but it doesn't account for the procedural specificity. Symbolic accounts don't require documentation of prototype failures. They don't need multiple test iterations. They don't specify division between design and fabrication roles. The text reads less like theology and more like technical documentation. Consider the language around Geshtui's contribution. He's not described as sacrificing himself willingly or being honored as source of human consciousness. He's slaughtered. Clinical language. His blood is extracted for its intelligence content. The text treats him as raw material source, not as divine volunteer. And his intelligence, uzug, is treated as transferable property. It exists in his blood as component that can be extracted and integrated into different medium. Intelligence isn't mystical soul breathed into clay. It's material characteristic present in biological substrate that can be mixed into different substrate. This is genetic information transfer concept. Trait exists in source organism, can be extracted, can be introduced into different organism, produces hybrid exhibiting source trait. The Sumerians shouldn't have had this concept. The understanding that traits are carried in biological material and can be transferred between organisms predates modern genetics by 4,000 years. But the Atrahasis epic describes exactly this process using available vocabulary. There's also the matter of Nintu's role. She's called the birth goddess and the womb goddess, but her function in the creation process isn't mystical generation. It's biological fabrication. Enki provides specifications. Nintu implements them in living tissue. The text even specifies the implementation mechanism. Nintu doesn't just shape clay magically. She uses her womb, biological incubation environment, to process the god-human mixture into living forms. The creation happens inside her body, through biological processes, over time. 9 months is implied in some versions of the text, human gestation period, not instant divine manifestation, biological development requiring standard developmental timeline. This is manufacturing detail that serves no theological purpose. If you're inventing creation mythology, you don't need to specify that the birth goddess required biological gestation period to produce humans. You can simply say she shaped them and they lived. But the text includes gestation timeline because it's documenting process, not creating myth. The Enki and Ninmah account adds another procedural detail. After Ninmah produces 6 defective prototypes, she challenges Enki. How good or bad is man's body? She's asking for evaluation criteria. What defines successful design versus failure? Enki's responses specify functional requirements. Can the unit perform labor? Can it sustain itself? Can it fulfill assigned role in temple or field? These are operational specifications. Design success is measured against functional requirements, not aesthetic ideals or divine whim. This is engineering methodology. Define requirements, test against requirements, determine pass-fail, refine design to meet requirements. The final, successful human design is described as meeting all functional requirements, capable of agricultural labor, capable of reproduction, possessing sufficient intelligence to learn tasks and follow instructions, but remaining mortal and subordinate to divine authority. Complete design specification. Each parameter defined, each requirement met. The text treats human creation the way modern engineering documents treat any complex manufacturing process. Source materials, integration procedures, prototype testing, quality metrics, design refinement, production scaling. Either the Sumerians invented technical documentation methodology 4,000 years early and chose to apply it to creation mythology for reasons that remain unclear, or they were documenting an actual engineering process using the vocabulary available to describe biological and material manipulation. The text itself doesn't speculate about which interpretation is correct. It just documents the procedure with the same administrative precision applied to documenting grain processing or copper smelting. Mix clay and blood thoroughly. Shape according to specifications. Test for defects. Refine as needed. Produce at scale. Record results. But the creation process included one feature that wasn't part of the original specifications. One design element that would create cascading problems the assembly never anticipated when they authorized human production. Humans could reproduce, and they were very good at it. The Atrahasis epic documents what happens after successful human creation: rapid population growth. The text states that after 200 years, the land extended and the peoples multiplied. The land was bellowing like a bull. The comparison is agricultural. Not teeming with life or flourishing abundantly, bellowing like a bull. Loud, disruptive. The problem isn't that humans exist. The problem is the noise. Enlil complains to the assembly, "The noise of mankind has become too intense for me. With their uproar, I am deprived of sleep." This triggers the crisis sequence already documented in Claim Lesser 5. Disease, drought, famine, flood, each measure designed to reduce population. Each failing to achieve permanent reduction because the surviving humans simply multiply again. But after the flood, when the assembly reconvenes to address the recurring population problem, they implement a different solution. Not temporary emergency measures. Permanent structural modifications to human design. The text documents 3 specific modifications. Modification 1. Non-bearing women. Enki creates a category of women who cannot bear children. The text uses specific terminology. Certain women are made barren, not through individual circumstances, but through categorical designation. It's a class of women designed into the population structure. These aren't women who happen to be infertile. These are women whose infertility is an engineered feature, deliberately introduced into the population mix to limit overall reproductive capacity. Modification 2. Infant mortality. The text describes Enki creating the she-demon Pashatu who snatches infants. This is usually interpreted as mythological explanation for infant death rates in ancient Mesopotamia. But the language is design language. The demon isn't a tragic reality being explained. The demon is deliberately created. Enki made her as population control mechanism. Built-in infant mortality integrated into population system. Modification 3. Celibate priestesses. Certain women are designated as temple priestesses prohibited from bearing children. Not temporary service followed by normal life. Permanent removal from reproductive pool. The text frames these as taboos established by divine decree. Women in these categories are forbidden to reproduce. The taboos aren't explained as moral or spiritual requirements. They're installed as population regulation mechanisms. The 3 modifications work together as system-level population control. Some women cannot reproduce, barren class. Some infants don't survive, mortality mechanism. Some women must not reproduce, priestess prohibition. The result, reproductive capacity of human population is permanently reduced below maximum potential. Population can still grow, but not at unchecked exponential rate. This is systems engineering. Identify problem, unchecked population growth. Analyze root cause, unlimited reproductive capacity. Implement multi-layered solution targeting different points in reproduction cycle. Monitor results to ensure problem doesn't recur. The text explicitly states the purpose. Let there be a third among the peoples women who bear, and women who do not bear. 1/3 of women removed from bearing potential. Mathematical precision. Population growth constrained by structural modification to reproductive capacity. Mainstream scholarship treats these as etiological myths, stories invented to explain existing phenomena. Ancient societies had high infant mortality. Some women were infertile. Some served as celibate priestesses. The myths explain these realities by attributing them to divine decisions. This explanation works if you read each element in isolation, But the text doesn't present them in isolation. It presents them as integrated system implemented specifically to prevent population from exceeding sustainable levels. And, critically, the text doesn't present these as punishments, not consequences of human wrongdoing, not divine anger at human behavior. They're engineering solutions to operational problem. After the flood, the assembly faced a design question. Humans are necessary workforce, but unchecked human multiplication creates unsustainable noise and resource consumption. Solution: modify human design to include population regulation mechanisms. No moral judgment, no punishment narrative, just problem identified, solution designed, modifications implemented, system updated. The text even documents Enlil's explicit satisfaction with the solution. Now, then, the noise of humans has become too intense for me. By the incantation may there be silence, let me sleep. Problem solved. System stabilized. Record updated. But there's another detail in the population control modifications that reveals sophisticated systems thinking. The modifications aren't uniform across all populations. The text specifies that some peoples have higher rates of non-bearing women. Others have lower rates. Some regions have higher infant mortality, others lower. This is distributed regulation, not uniform global reduction, but variable local adjustments, creating overall system stability while allowing regional variation. Modern equivalent: distributed control systems that maintain overall parameters while permitting local fluctuation. More sophisticated than simple uniform constraint. If this were merely mythological explanation for infant mortality and infertility, there's no reason to document regional variation. But if it's documenting actual population control system design, regional variation makes sense. Different populations in different environmental conditions require different regulatory parameters. The text also reveals that these modifications are permanent, not temporary measures like the disease, drought, and famine that preceded the flood. These are structural changes to how human populations function, built into the system, irreversible. The language used is decree, simtu, divine decision that becomes fixed reality. Once decreed, these limitations become operational parameters of human existence. They weren't moral laws humans could choose to obey or disobey. They were design constraints built into how human reproduction functions. And the text documents when these modifications were implemented. After the flood, during the Assembly's policy review session, as solution to prevent recurrence of pre-flood population crisis. Timeline, decision point, implementation, documentation, all recorded with administrative precision. This creates an uncomfortable implication. If the Sumerians believed these weren't natural features of human existence, but modifications added after initial design proved too successful, then they understood human limitations as engineered constraints rather than inherent biological realities. They didn't view infant mortality as tragic inevitability or infertility as random misfortune. They understood these as regulatory mechanisms installed to prevent system overload. Either remarkably sophisticated systems analysis applied retroactively to creation mythology, or documentation of actual belief that human population dynamics were deliberately designed and subsequently modified when initial design parameters proved inadequate. The text doesn't advocate for accepting infant death or celebrating infertility. It documents them as functional elements of population regulation system implemented by decision-makers who had authority to modify human biological parameters. Modern readers find this disturbing because it removes moral framework from phenomena we prefer to understand as natural tragedies. But Sumerian texts don't impose moral framework. They document administrative decisions and their implementations. Humans multiplied excessively. Assembly determined this was problem requiring solution. Multiple temporary solutions failed. Permanent structural modifications were designed and implemented. Problem resolved. System stabilized. Filed in archives next to other policy implementations. But if humans were designed with reproductive capacity, then modified with reproductive limitations, then the deepest question about human creation remains. Who designed the original specifications? Who had the capability to create biological beings, test prototypes, refine designs, and later modify reproductive parameters? The Sumerian texts answer this question directly, but the answer raises more questions than it resolves, because the beings who designed humans, according to these texts, didn't stay. They modified the system, stabilized population dynamics, and then, according to later Sumerian records, they withdrew. Around 2000 BC, something changed in Sumerian texts. The language shifted, the descriptions altered, the relationship between the Anunnaki and human cities transformed from direct presence to distant absence. The clearest documentation appears in the lamentation literature, texts composed during and after the fall of the Ur-Third dynasty. These aren't mythological narratives. They're contemporary accounts written in real time as political catastrophe unfolded. The lamentation over the destruction of Ur is the most detailed. Composed shortly after Ur fell to Elamite invasion around 2004 BC, it documents not just military defeat, but something the text treats as far more significant: divine withdrawal. The pattern repeats throughout the lamentation. Nana, Ur's patron deity, pleads before the assembly to spare his city. The assembly deliberates. The decision goes against Ur. And then the text documents what happens next. Nana, who loves his city, left his city. Ningal, who loves her people, abandoned her sheepfold. Not was driven out by invaders. Not fled in defeat. Left. Abandoned. Voluntary departure. Administrative withdrawal from operational site. The text continues cataloging the withdrawals. Inanna abandoned Uruk. Enki abandoned Eridu. Enlil abandoned Nippur. City after city. Each deity documented as withdrawing from their base of operations. The language is consistent. They left, they abandoned, they departed. Present tense becoming past tense. Active involvement becoming historical memory. And critically, the text doesn't describe this as temporary retreat. These aren't gods fleeing disaster who will return when conditions improve. The language is permanent administrative closure. The divine plans were altered. Not the gods were angry or divine favor was withdrawn. The plans, organizational strategies, operational protocols were altered. Administrative language again. System reorganization. Operational parameters changed. Other lamentation texts from the same period document similar withdrawals. The lamentation over Sumer and Ur, the Nippur lament, the Eridu lament, all describe deities departing their cities during the political chaos of the Ur-Third collapse. But the pattern extends beyond simple departure narratives. The texts document a transition in how the Anunnaki are discussed before versus after this period. Before approximately 2000 BC, Sumerian texts describe the Anunnaki as physically present in their temple cities. They receive daily offerings. They make appearances. They participate directly in city governance. Temple texts document provisions allocated for divine meals. Ritual texts describe protocols for divine audiences. The gods are treated as resident administrators requiring daily support services. After approximately 2000 BC, the language changes. The Anunnaki are still addressed in prayers and hymns. Temples continue operating. Rituals persist. But the texts stop describing direct presence. Gods are invoked, not encountered. Petitioned, not consulted. Remembered, not engaged. The transition is documented in real time. The lamentation texts sit at the boundary. They describe the moment of departure, record the grief it generated, preserve the last interactions before withdrawal became permanent. And they document that this transition happened simultaneously across multiple city-states, not gradually over centuries, as cities individually evolved away from older religious practices. Coordinated withdrawal, multiple deities departing their operational bases within the same narrow time frame. The mainstream explanation attributes this to the political chaos of the Ur-the-Third collapse. The theory, when the last great Sumerian empire fell, when Elamite invaders sacked the major cities, the theological crisis required explanation. The lamentation texts explain military defeat as divine abandonment. Gods chose to leave, therefore cities fell. It's a reasonable explanation. Defeated peoples often explain loss through divine disfavor. Theology adapts to historical catastrophe, but this explanation doesn't account for the specific language used. If the texts were explaining military defeat through divine anger, they should describe gods withdrawing favor, punishing human sin, allowing destruction as consequence of moral failure. Biblical prophets use this framework constantly. Israel sinned, therefore God permitted conquest. Moral cause, divine punishment, clear theology. But the Sumerian lamentation texts don't use punishment language. They use administrative withdrawal language. The gods didn't abandon cities because humans failed morally. The assembly altered the plans. Operational parameters changed. Direct administration ended. Nana pleads for Ur not because the city sinned but because it's his assigned jurisdiction. He argues based on administrative responsibility, not moral judgment. The assembly denies his plea based on policy decision, not righteous anger. Ur falls because operational protocols changed, not because divine punishment was deserved. The distinction matters. Punishment theology requires human moral failure. Administrative withdrawal requires only policy revision. And the texts document policy revision, not moral judgment. There's another detail that complicates the political explanation. The withdrawals aren't described as responses to specific cities' defeats. They're described as coordinated organizational decision, affecting multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. If each city's patron deity withdrew in response to that specific city's fall, the withdrawals would be staggered. Ur's gods leaving when Ur fell. Uruk's gods leaving when Uruk fell. Each departure timing matched to local catastrophe. But the texts describe simultaneous coordinated withdrawal across the entire Sumerian region, as though a system-wide decision was implemented affecting all operational sites at once. This is organizational restructuring language. Not individual responses to local conditions, but coordinated policy change affecting entire administrative structure. The lamentation texts also document what happens after withdrawal. Human rulers continue governing, cities continue operating, economic systems continue functioning, but the direct divine presence, the daily temple meals, the ritual audiences, the documented interactions between human administrators and divine overseers, those end. What continues is invocation, prayer, ritual performance toward deities who are addressed but no longer encountered. The religious structure persists, but the operational reality documented in earlier texts, gods as resident administrators in temple cities, that reality transitions to memory. And the Sumerians documented this transition as it happened. The lamentation texts sit at the boundary between direct administration and remote invocation. They preserve the moment when the system changed. Modern scholarship generally treats this as theological evolution. The theory. Earlier, Sumerians had naive conception of gods as physically present beings. Over time, theology matured. Later, Sumerians understood gods as transcendent beings addressed through ritual rather than encountered directly. Its standard religious development model. Primitive, concrete thinking evolves toward sophisticated, abstract theology. But this model requires the Sumerians to have undergone theological evolution without acknowledging they were evolving. The texts don't describe gradual development toward more sophisticated understanding. They describe abrupt administrative withdrawal at a specific historical moment, documented in real time by scribes recording what they believed was actually happening. If this were theological evolution, you'd expect transitional texts showing changing conceptions of divine presence, philosophical discussions about nature of divinity, theological treatises explaining why earlier texts described gods one way, while contemporary experience suggests different understanding. But those transitional discussions don't exist. The change is documented as event, not evolution. The gods were present. The gods withdrew, the system changed, record updated, and the withdrawal is permanent. After 2000 BC, no Sumerian or Babylonian text returns to the earlier mode of describing gods as physically present administrators in temple cities. The pre-2000 BC operational reality becomes historical memory. Later texts reference it, when the gods dwelt among us, but always as past, never as present. The pattern matches organizational downsizing, full on-site administration transitions to remote oversight. Local operations continue under human management. Senior administrators withdraw to centralized location. Periodic communications replace daily presence. Either the Sumerians documented their own theological evolution, using uniquely administrative language unlike any other culture's religious development, or they documented what they genuinely believed happened. The beings who had maintained direct presence in their cities, who had established the jurisdictional system, who had created humans as workforce, who had managed civilization through assembly decisions. Those beings altered their operational protocols and withdrew from daily administration. The texts don't speculate about why. They document the withdrawal, record the grief it generated, preserve the assembly decision that authorized it, and update the records to reflect new reality. Gods addressed remotely rather than encountered locally. administrative transition, policy change, system reorganization, personnel redeployment, filed in the archives with same neutral precision used to document every other organizational modification, 10 claims preserved in cuneiform, 10 pieces of an archive that refuses to fit categories we've built to contain it. Rulers who reigned tens of thousands of years, documented with ledger precision. Kingship that descended from heaven, using cargo transfer terminology. Divine beings organized into jurisdictional hierarchy with non-overlapping portfolios. Assembly meetings following parliamentary procedure, making decisions that sometimes failed. Gods who fled disasters they couldn't control, cowering and hiding from consequences they'd initiated. Knowledge systems existing as transferable packages, stolen and installed rather than invented. Humans created as workforce solution through documented engineering process. Reproductive capacity, modified after initial design, proved too successful. And coordinated withdrawal, documented in real time as administrative reorganization. Each claim in isolation can be explained. Mythological exaggeration, political projection, theological symbolism, literary device, etiological fiction. Comfortable explanations exist for every individual piece, but the pattern resists explanation, because the pattern is consistent across 1,000 years of texts, across competing city-states that had every reason to adjust narratives in their favor, across scribal traditions in different locations, copying and recopying these accounts with identical details preserved. The pattern is administrative, not poetic, not symbolic, not mythological in structure or tone. Documentation using the same bureaucratic precision applied to grain inventories and land surveys. Cold, neutral, obsessively detailed record-keeping. The pattern treats impossible events with identical gravity to mundane events. 800-year reigns and 28-year reigns recorded in the same format. Divine jurisdictional disputes and human property disputes using the same legal language. Assembly meetings of gods and assembly meetings of city elders following the same procedural protocols. And the pattern never explains itself. No Sumerian text ever adds, "Of course, these are symbolic numbers representing eras." No scribe ever notes, "Obviously, kingship didn't literally descend from the sky. This is metaphorical divine legitimization." The texts state, document, record, and move on, as though the scribes saw nothing unusual about cataloging the impossible alongside the mundane, which leaves us with 3 possibilities, none comfortable. Possibility 1. The Sumerians invented sophisticated administrative mythology, unique in the ancient world. They projected their bureaucratic culture onto creation narratives with unprecedented consistency. They maintained this projection across competing political entities for over a millennium. They documented divine incompetence, engineering failures, and organizational mistakes, despite these elements undermining religious authority. They applied systems, thinking, and engineering methodology to theological questions 4,000 years before such frameworks existed elsewhere. Possible, but requires attributing to Sumerians a level of theological creativity and administrative philosophy that appears nowhere else in their contemporary world and wouldn't appear again until modern times. Possibility 2. They inherited records from a pre-Sumerian source. They transcribed documents they didn't fully understand. They preserved details that didn't match their own experience because they believed they were maintaining accurate archives of older material. This explains the consistency. They were copying, not inventing. Explains the administrative precision. They were preserving original tone. Explains the strange elements that don't serve obvious propaganda purposes. They were faithful transcribers, not creative authors. But this raises the question, what source? Where did records come from that described impossible reign kings, assembly minutes, engineering processes, administrative withdrawals? And if Sumerians were copying older records, why does no Sumerian text ever mention their working from earlier source material? Possibility. 3. They documented actual events using available vocabulary. They recorded what they believed happened. Beings with jurisdictions managed civilization through assembly governance, created humans through documented process, modified population parameters when necessary, and eventually withdrew from direct administration. The gods weren't supernatural deities, but administrators in a system the Sumerians inherited and operated within. This possibility requires accepting that something the texts describe actually occurred, even though it doesn't fit our historical framework. It treats Sumerian scribes as reliable witnesses documenting reality they experienced or had credible information about, rather than as mythmakers or confused transcribers. Modern scholarship generally defaults to possibility 1, sophisticated mythological invention, because it requires no revision to historical understanding. Ancient people invented elaborate mythologies. Sumerians invented an unusually bureaucratic one, mystery solved. But possibility 1 requires explaining away cumulative weight of administrative specificity, jurisdictional precision, engineering methodology, procedural documentation, systems thinking, and coordinated organizational behavior that appears in no other contemporary culture and wouldn't reappear for millennia. The honest, scholarly position isn't certainty about which possibility is correct. The honest position is acknowledgement that we have these records, we can read the language, and we cannot reconcile the content with our historical categories. The Sumerian archives document beings called Anunnaki, with same precision used to document grain shipments. They catalog jurisdictions with same detail used to catalog property boundaries. They record assembly decisions with same procedural language used to record city council meetings. They document human creation with same engineering specificity used to document bronze metallurgy. Too organized to be mythology, too strange to be history, too consistent to be fiction, too precise to be confusion, cannot confirm. No physical evidence of 28,800-year kings, no archaeological proof of Anunnaki presence, no remains of divine assembly halls, no genetic markers confirming blood and clay human engineering, cannot dismiss. The texts exist, thousands of them, spanning centuries, preserved across multiple independent archives, copied and recopied by scribes whose professional credibility depended on accuracy, maintained with perfect consistency by cities that politically opposed each other. The evidence is textual, not physical, but it's textual evidence of unusual character, not epic poetry or theological philosophy or moral instruction. Administrative archives, meeting minutes, policy documentation, engineering reports, personnel records, filed right next to the grain inventories. The Sumerian king list sits in the British Museum. The Atrahasis epic sits in university collections. The lamentation texts sit in archaeological archives. Clay tablets pressed 4,000 years ago by scribes who counted barley and counted divine years with identical bureaucratic neutrality. They wrote it all down, every impossible claim, every strange detail, every administrative procedure that makes no theological sense. They documented jurisdiction transfers and assembly votes, and engineering specifications and population control modifications, and coordinated withdrawals. And they never explained any of it, never justified the impossible numbers, never clarified the transfer terminology, never apologized for the bureaucratic tone where modern readers expect mythological grandeur. They just recorded, because recording is what scribes do. Grain shipments and god assemblies, temple revenues and divine jurisdictions, barley rations and 36,000-year reigns, all pressed into wet clay with the same neutral precision, all preserved in the same archives, all maintained with the same administrative care. We still don't know what to do with it. The investigation remains open. Thank you for staying with this examination. These 10 claims from Sumerian archives resist easy resolution. They sit in museum collections and university libraries waiting. Clay, pressed by hands that counted every grain of barley, also counted years that don't fit our chronologies. The same administrative precision applied to both. Whether these records ever find resolution or remain mysteries we carry forward, the value is in asking better questions, not forcing comfortable explanations onto uncomfortable evidence, but sitting with the discomfort, acknowledging what the texts actually say, even when what they say doesn't fit what we expect ancient texts to say. The Sumerians left us archives we still don't know how to read, not because the language is unclear, because what the language describes is too organized to be myth, too strange to be history. Sleep well, and let these puzzles settle however they need to in your mind.